Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we have certainly well over 100 people in the room already, and it's with pleasure that I get to introduce our speaker for this afternoon and also moderate some of the questions, which I hope will flow into the Q&A session. So thank you for coming back after a long weekend. I hope everyone enjoyed the long weekend. And without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today, at least for this session this afternoon. Who you see on screen is Professor Brett van Niekerk, who's a professor at the Durban University of Technology, and he's actually also been involved in other universities within South Africa. Brett, to many of you, will be a rather familiar face. He's also recently organized, as in last week, organized the ICCWS, which is one of the conferences on cybersecurity and warfare, and that was held in Johannesburg. He happens to be very active in many other conference program committees, various international working groups as well. One that's rather noteworthy is that he happens to be the chair of the IFIP working group on ICT in peace and war, and that brings him into contact with quite a few researchers overseas. So there's a very a significant footprint to the research that they're doing at the DUT. He's also the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Cyber Warfare and Terrorism. So he gets to also deal with a lot of journal articles that flow through as well. Brett is furthermore NRF rated, and I don't know precisely which rating, but regardless, NRF rating is a very prestigious step, and that's not a surprise given that he's got well over 80 publications and has been presenting at conferences nationally and also internationally for quite some years. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Brett, and allow you to proceed with your presentation, and you'll see me off camera. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. As the brief said, we'll be dealing with IoT security. I've got a few slides here, and then time permitting, I'll try and do some demonstrations through my browser just on various search engines and so on to give you a look at what is available out there. So essentially, I'll just give an introduction to IoT and a few other related concepts, because IoT does cross over into a few of the other fields that have already been covered in lectures. Obviously, the focus will be the security concerns with IoT, some of the best practices, and also I've added in some legislation related to IoT security. In a few countries, that's becoming a little bit more predominant. And then, as I mentioned, a few of the search engines that would allow us to detect IoT devices that are open on the internet. So what is IoT? The obvious one, official name, Internet of Things. However, a probably more accurate version is Internet of Everything. And another tongue-in-cheek version would be Internet of Trouble, which we'll notice in a few slides' time. And in terms of Internet of Everything, and this is a bit of a challenge that we do face, is quite often people try and put everything in a box. But when it comes to IoT, sometimes things can't be kept in a box. So there's a range of things that can actually be classified as IoT. From some of the obvious ones, your smart appliances, smart meters, smart TVs, and so on, the wearables, but also your CCTV cameras, the web cameras, and so on. But in the top right there, I put a F-35 Lightning II, as in a fighter aircraft, because essentially that is a flying server with a whole bunch of sensors attached to it. So when you start looking at what IoT is, it can really be anything that's connected to the internet. Your multifunction printer devices, even the internet routers and the hubs and everything connected, if there are still hubs connected to the network. In buildings, you might have your heating, your ventilation, your air conditioning as also connected in a smart building. And we'll demonstrate the security concerns around that as well. So just a couple of cartoons on the left. They connected the phone to the network, and then one thing led to the other. So it's now the fridge, the microwave, the dog, the car, the washing machine, and everything. And on the right there, the fridge is busy complaining because they didn't listen that they should have bought milk on the way home. So just to illustrate, the pervasiveness of IoT, and that it is ultimately still sometimes outside of the box of what people really think. So we can break IoT down into a number of things. Your consumer IoT is like all the smart appliances. They're generally a bit newer, if you want to put it that way, compared to the industrial IoT. And we'll go through the comparison between these two in a bit more detail later. But your industrial IoT is sort of an evolution of what was already there. Um, there's a whole bunch of other terms creeping out of the woodwork: Internet of Medical Things, so connected X-ray machines, pacemakers, insulin pumps, and so on. That have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth capability. Your Internet of Battlefield Things, so I mentioned the F-35, but again, logistics, sort of base management in forward deployed bases and so on. So there's a lot of interconnectedness there. And when you look at some military philosophies of a network-centric warfare, where pretty much all the equipment is kind of interconnected, that it is quite a major thing. IoT is big in agriculture. We do a lot of that at DUT, in terms of you can have sort of sensors in the soil for pH level, moisture, and so on, temperature sensors, UV sensors, wind sensors, the whole lot. I was in the transportation sectors and supply chain. So again, that is quite an interesting one, where you have RFID, cranes, and all the equipment, again, has sensors in them for predictive analytics and so on. So as I mentioned, a comparison between your consumer or commercial IoT versus your industrial IoT. Your commercial tends to be more of a revolution in that it's things that never used to be connected to the internet and were never really supposed to be connected. Things like the TVs, and sometimes you do get really ridiculous things that are now smart, like a mousetrap. Um, versus your industrial internet of things as an evolution. In your industry and your operational technology, the whole point was always to have remote access, where the engineers could then monitor what's happening at the plant, without actually going into a rather uncomfortable environment or a hazardous environment. What's really changed now is in the industrial sphere that they're moving away from proprietary algorithms like DNP3, and some of the others, Modbus and so on, into more IP-based, which will kind of align to what's happening in the commercial space. The commercial space is preoccupied with the things. It's a smart TV, it's a smart toaster, it's a smart whatever it is. Whereas in industry, with the operational technology, it's still more focused on the data, being able to monitor what's happening with industrial processes. Commercial, very ad hoc, so a Raspberry Pi can suddenly pitch up on a network, and then can disappear the next day if you're actually monitoring those things. Whereas still in the industrial environment, it's going to be structured. You need to make sure that you have mission critical types of data being transferred. And that's, I think, one of the major differences between the two. Whilst your commercial IoT can be important, it's not really mission critical. If the smart TVs in a bank go down, not displaying the marketing or whatever, it's not that critical. You can fall over into a manual process. But if you lose monitoring of a wind turbine or a nuclear power station, that could be a bit of a problem. A lot of the commercial stuff is still proprietary solutions, new standards, new devices, and things coming up, where the users tend to service, or at least sometimes the manufacturer. Whereas in your industrial space, it'll be the user, the equipment manufacturer, the vendors, and there's still a lot of existing standards and devices and so on. It's, as we said, an evolution of how it goes. So a basic architecture of IoT. And I'm going to start at the bottom because that's where the devices sit. That's the sensing layer. So those could all potentially be a sensor or an actuator. So if you think a Raspberry Pi might have a web camera built into it, it could be a temperature sensor. It could be just a smart well, let's take the smart doorbells. You've got a camera, you can open the door remotely and so on. That all needs to connect together. So that's the next layer, which is your network layer. How do these things communicate? And with the commercial IoT coming or evolving, we're seeing a resurgence of a number of protocols and things that were kind of seem to be dead and buried previously, but they seem to be coming back because they are lightweight protocols. So it makes things a little bit faster to transfer the data coming from the IoT. The next layer obviously is what to do with all the data that these things generate. So that is the processing layer, which will then obviously feed through back to the application layer, which is what the people interface with. So the dashboards and so on. If we take this a little bit further in a bit more detail, so if you put IoT in the context of the fourth industrial revolution overall, bringing in things like big data analytics, cloud, and artificial intelligence, you'll see on the left there the IoT devices, be it cameras, smart devices, phones, tablets, and whatnot. But a lot of them might be using the new, resurfacing algorithms like MQTT. Zigbee used to be an ad hoc wireless networking, which way back when I was working with it wasn't really useful in the environments that we were in. But now with IoT, it's made a resurgence. Then with that, you've got your data connectivity, sometimes going to an IoT gateway or multiple IoT gateways across the internet or enterprise network, using generally your Ethernet and your TCP IP, to your cloud management platform, because generally the amount of data that you're using on-premise will potentially be problematic. And that's where you have your big data analytics sitting on a server up in the cloud, with your artificial intelligence, machine learning doing what it needs to do, with predictive analytics. On the side of all of this, you'll probably also maybe get things like social media, maybe transactional data, financial data, and so on, supply chain data coming in from the business side of things, feeding into your big data analytics. So an example of this could be having a bunch of sensors on a specific vehicle. And the whole point of that is knowing that when a specific product vehicle has moved X number of times, it's going to need to be serviced. And tying that in with enterprise supply chain, you'll then now be able to order the relevant parts just in time, hopefully before the thing actually gets to a point of failure. So you can try and predict, when there could be a maintenance issue in some of the equipment, which means scheduling becomes that much easier, and you can do so ahead of time. Then obviously all of that is through the various APIs. The humans can connect through that with the management portal, and look at the various charts and whatnot that can be produced by the software. Then related topics, edge and fog computing. The definition is slightly different here, but essentially it is almost the same thing. A decent concept. Edge computing, I think the term came up a little bit earlier, meaning that the networks and devices near the user will be used for processing. So the processing is now happening closer to the source, meaning that there can be faster processing, greater volumes, and then that pre-processed data can be pushed up into the cloud for further processing. So it kind of is more of a distributed processing type of scenario. Fog is similar, so it's a combination of cloud and the devices. Again, the whole concept is extending the cloud closer towards the edge of the enterprise network, allowing your data, your applications, and so on to be moved closer to the end users. So again, it's a fairly similar concept as well. So we just look at a very basic architecture, and you'll notice it's fairly similar then to what we see with the IoT architecture. You have your devices with your edge or fog layers, your IoT gateways connecting through to the enterprise network up into the cloud. And then obviously what's missing in this diagram is the sort of the human interaction in terms of the actual management platforms and APIs. But essentially, the concept is there, and IoT combined with cloud really is what enables this type of distributed computing. In the old days, we used to talk about clusters and so on, but now with so many smart devices, cloud, and so on, this can be considered almost the evolution of distributed computing. So what we're here for, security. So I've got a few slides of some interesting examples, and then I'll talk a little bit more detail around this. One example, Fridge sending spam emails. So clearly your devices are not secure and can be used for things that they're not really designed for. If a fridge can send an email to alert you to buying milk on the way home, then in theory, if you can compromise it, it can send emails to just about anybody for any purpose. On the top right, major smart TV vulnerabilities could allow for attacks. And in fact, some of the manufacturers were actually even warning that if you have these in the boardroom, you need to be careful what you say, because they cannot guarantee if they've been compromised that the hackers might actually be able to hear everything that's happening in the boardroom, which again is sort of counter to the point of why you have them there in the first place. Bottom left, during the elections back in, I can't remember which was the 2020 or the one before, people were hacking all the road signs, electronic road signs on the highways for various reasons, some supporting Bernie, some against Donald Trump, some against Hillary Clinton, and so on. But again, just it demonstrates that things you wouldn't really think of can be hacked and are on the network and on the internet. Bottom right is probably the most major set of attacks that we've seen, and really was a wake-up call. Mirai botnet, and I'll discuss that in a couple of slides' time, but massive DDoS attacks. Again, some security journalists, some other service providers, as well as Liberia. So in a couple of slides, I'll go more detail there. A few scary ones, things like your web cameras, your baby monitor feeds are exposed. Even your security cameras in home can be easily hacked, but they don't even need to be hacked. Just the transfer of information can actually tell someone if you're home or not. Because if you're not at home, nothing's changing, so there's a nice steady stream of data going out. When people are at home moving around, things change, there's more images, more data needs to be transferred up to the cloud. So there's a now inconsistent amount of data being transferred. Things change, so clearly someone is moving around in the house. So something as simple as that can actually determine if someone's away or not. The car makers and vehicles hacked via telematics, APIs, and so on. So car hacking has been going around for quite a while, even though that this article is only just over a year old. But at one of the conferences, I think it was at DEF CON in the US, that they had a whole hacking village just dedicated to cars. A couple of years ago during COVID, their hacking was focused on space infrastructure, so satellites and the base stations. So those are also connected. And interesting enough, I think it was, I can't remember when, the US had some of their satellites penetrated by a state actor. Then bottom left, a statement saying one ship is hacked every other day. I don't know how true that is, but there have been some severe incidents where ships have been impacted, that they've lost pretty much all the electronic navigation systems, had to navigate by chart in very congested waterways. In the maritime terms, that they had to declare what's known as a critical incident. We've had oil rigs where the safety systems were disabled and no one realized until there actually was an emergency. Off east coast of Africa, we've had an oil rig whilst drilling being tilted remotely, so that caused damage. And it was also off Mexico. Someone plugged in something they shouldn't have, which affected the positioning of an oil rig, and it started to drift whilst drilling. Fortunately, they managed to get it under control, because that could have caused a massive ecological disaster if it had shifted too far. And then on the bottom right, again, the medical things, the insulin pumps, the things like the pacemakers and so on. If it's got Wi-Fi and you can manage the things remotely, can someone do something malicious? So a bit more detail. Between 2016 and 2017, one of the reports, and I can't remember offhand which one, indicated a 600% increase in IoT security incidents. One, obviously, the more devices being put on the internet meant there was more scope for it, but also obviously the vulnerabilities were becoming more known, and people started targeting the IoT a lot more. So IoT itself can be considered an entry point into a broader network. The devices themselves are sometimes very insecure. In addition, you could have an unknown or rogue device planted in an environment. So there are security distributions like Kali Linux and some of the others that are designed for Raspberry Pis. And the Raspberry Pis, if you've looked at the recent ones, are actually decreasing in size. So it's fairly simple with the built-in Wi-Fi, Ethernet, Bluetooth, and whatnot on these things to then just have an LTE add-on, hide it behind a server, or if there's a rack with a few routers in a public area, stick it in there where someone can't see behind the plug. Let it connect to the Wi-Fi, go home, and then you can dial into the Raspberry Pi, and you're into the network. One of the challenges I've already alluded to is quite often existing devices on the network aren't considered as IoT. Organizations have this habit of chasing after a catchphrase. So, okay, cool, we need to deal with IoT because that's the biggest thing at the moment. So we're going to have an IoT project. And everything in that box of the project is IoT, and everything outside of that box is not IoT. And that becomes a problem when you have smart TVs and a lot of things that have been lying around on the network for years, but because some executive has now decided that we're doing IoT, those things are still excluded. So one of the cartoons around which I'll show you in the next one, Finland, the buildings, the environmental control system had been hacked through the thermostats during winter, and someone managed to turn it off. Another interesting one was in the US, casinos were hacked through their fish tank because they had a connected thermometer for some tropical fish because they needed a specific temperature. It was insecure, and someone got in. The other side is we've already mentioned the Mirai botnet in terms of the DDoS attack. So that's the DIN service provider saw over terabit per second raw data. So this is not the fancy DDoS like reflection attacks or anything like that. That is just pure raw data coming from compromised CCTV cameras and the associated PVRs. In Liberia, essentially, their gateways were kind of flooded, and essentially the citizens couldn't really get access to the broader internet due to the DDoS attack. The theory was it was targeting one of the mobile providers for some reason. At the time, I can remember discussing it with some of the people. But another interesting one, seeing we're all, or most of us are academics to a certain degree, there was a university in the UK. Just before the weekend, the hackers noticed that they had a number of devices that were accessible. They had not changed the default passwords. The hackers kindly changed the default password for them and proceeded to use those devices to DDoS their DNS server. There were around 5,000 devices compromised. So that poor IT team had a very rough weekend trying to regain control of the devices, and they no longer had access to their own devices because the passwords had been changed. The other side, again, going back to the rogue devices and so on, that IoT can be used for traffic capturing. So adding in things plugged onto the network can be used for monitoring what's happening, the traffic capturing, rerouting, and so on. And obviously then completely bypassing any form of perimeter security, primarily because you can dial in directly to some of these devices. So talking of that, if you consider the traditional network perimeter, you would have an organization and most of your network, the servers and so on would be on-premise somewhere within the organizational physical perimeter. So if you start adding cloud into the mix, you would have your logical perimeter being expanded a bit to a few other physical locations, maybe VPNs, some other form of connectivity. Some might even cross a national border. In the old days, we had no data centers in South Africa, so we were generally looking at Ireland and West Germany for our data centers. Some may be in the US. So if you go a step further, when you start adding things like your IoT and your mobile devices, as well as your social media and all sorts of other public connections, you kind of very quickly start losing control of where your perimeter of the organization actually is. And that is a challenge because one compromised device, and then you essentially do not have a perimeter at all when you've been breached. And next thing you know, you're getting phone calls threatening to expose all your sensitive information because it's sitting on the dark web somewhere. So that's a concern. These things really are disruptive for the perimeter, and that's one of the biggest security concerns that we have when we're adding all of these devices on. They're ad hoc, you can't control them properly, and you never know what's going to crop up next. So some of the security concerns, just to summarize that from what we've been talking about, the default and weak passwords, that's one of the real problem areas. If you do not change those, you are highly likely to go in for a bad time because someone can then very easily figure out what the default password is, change it for you, and use those devices for something malicious. All these new resurging protocols like MQTT and so on are insecure. They weren't really designed that much for security in those days. So authentication, encryption aren't there. So ideally, you need to find something with lightweight encryption to try and secure those. Physical security is a big problem. If someone can gain access to the organization's network or a network port, plugging into these devices, not a problem. In addition, having all these devices creates a bit of a physical security problem. It is how do you secure all of them from being accessed, picked up, and stolen? Some of them don't have secure hardware storage. Again, that means there could be a lot of data lying around on easily accessible devices. Thinking of things like your multifunction printers, the hard drives on those things are not secure, and quite often they are in a semi-public area. Patching with IoT becomes a huge problem, one from the infrequent sort of release of the security patches, but also if you think you have 1,000 devices, it's going to be difficult to try and patch all of those things. The insecure firmware and software, again, relating back to the patching. So if that isn't insecure in the first instance, that's going to be a bit of a challenge. And we've seen this quite often. Things like those sort of baby monitor cameras and so on. A lot of the stuff is hard-coded, and as a result, there are vulnerabilities which are essentially hard-coded into the thing. And essentially, when we're talking about the perimeter, the IoT creates an increased attack surface. You have unidentified rogue devices, but the problem is it's not identified as a security risk because of the catchphrase. We're defining what we're going to consider as an IoT project, and we forget about everything else that's in the environment, and they're not considered in a lot of the assessments and so on. So just to reinforce the point, on the left there, I mentioned the cartoon around the thermostat, because essentially the temperature got turned down to very cold temperatures because it was too busy with the DDoS attack. And then the little camera sitting there saying you need to join the bot army. On the right then, you're buying a toaster, and in the future you might need to buy a firewall to go with your toaster if these things are connected. So, best practices, and we can go through these fairly quickly because a lot of them are low-hanging fruit and common sense. Use strong passwords and always change the default password. Very simple to do, solves a lot of the problems. Network segmentation, make sure these things are firewalled, whether it's operational technology, IoT, etc. Have the firewalls at least trying to semi-control the data flows and the connections to the IoT, and also make use of virtual LANs. Whilst it's not an ideal security technology, it does make things a little bit more difficult if an IoT device is compromised to actually break out into some of the more sensitive enterprise networks. Where possible, use the secure protocols. I can remember dealing with an IoT project when they were just introducing the things, that they were using a gimmicky connected coffee machine, so you can order from your laptop and go and collect the coffee. But they're using MQTT, and they said, no, it's secure, we can log in. It's got a basic authentication, and we just left it for a while. And during that process, the news broke that the authentication for MQTT is actually very vulnerable. So they had to rethink all their security. One of the things that we were playing with was network access control, was actually quite useful. So if the devices do not have a certain level of patching or security to them, they are then isolated on the network into sort of like a guest zone to be able to patch themselves or get patched before they're allowed onto the network. And in preparation for the network access control, we actually found a number of things like Raspberry Pis and whatnot connected to the network that really shouldn't have been there. We don't know why they were there. It could have been, people doing innovation projects and stuff, going rogue, but just connecting things onto the network. Authentication, again, talking back to the strong passwords, but authentication and access control is quite important. If everyone has control or access to these devices, it's a problem. Monitoring is very, very important. You need to make sure what they're doing, what the traffic's doing. So if there's a surge in traffic coming from some of the devices, again, having a vendor tell us, yeah, for some reason that CCTV camera there is making some strange DNS callbacks. Our reaction was, well, maybe you need to actually go check that out. Don't tell us about it. Tell us why it's doing that. And that was the time just after the Mirai botnet. So you need to monitor what the devices are doing. If they do anything strange, check it out. Where possible, patch, update, secure it. Physical security, if you can, try and lock devices away where they can't be interfered with. If you think in a sort of a crane or something like that, where you have a number of sensors, you're going to have the crane operator that they might try and interfere with the devices more from a point of view that they feel like they're being monitored. But still, you want to secure the devices out of the way where people can't influence them. And then back onto the governance and risk management, which Prof. Bierman was talking about a couple weeks ago. This is the most critical thing, and that enables all the other best practices. If you have proper asset management, proper risk management, and audit, so you know what devices are on the network, where they are, and you are able to detect any rogue devices or anything that's gone wrong. If you have proper change management, so you know what security level you are at for the various devices, then pretty much everything else becomes routine. So that governance and risk management is key. And remember, it needs to be for everything on the network and not just for the little side project that one of the executives has decided to put in because they attended a conference the other day. In terms of the IoT best practice documents, there are quite a few. Microsoft's got quite a good one. Cloud Security Alliance has been working on this, so that they got a good document. Some others are designed more towards things like generic industrial systems, but the second one there is designed primarily for industrial Internet of Things. European Cybersecurity Agency, ENISA, has quite a useful online tool, which if you've got time, I'll demonstrate in a few minutes. So that there are quite a range of sort of best practices out there that can either be adapted for IoT or are already aligned to securing IoT. The other side is legislation. Obviously, some countries are getting a little more sticky around what they do in terms of actually using devices and sourcing them. So in the EU and the UK, the Cybersecurity Act from 2019, talking about digital projects, products and services, focus more towards the critical infrastructure and critical services, but has a voluntary certification concept there. So again, IoT, a lot of the manufacturers of certain devices can actually work with that. The Cybersecurity Resilience Act, which was proposed 2 years ago, is up for approval this year, focuses specifically on products with digital elements. So that could be your hardware, your software, your firmware, and could very easily include pretty much most of your IoT devices. And this is intending to potentially put in some mandatory requirements in terms of security. Your NIS1 and the NIS2 more recent directives, again focusing originally more on your essential service operators and providers, but your NIS2 expanding it to broader sectors. And what's interesting there is the cyber crisis management, which I think you're going to be getting if you haven't had those lectures coming up. There'll be one soon. And that I think is actually important with IoT, is if you get breached, you need to have good cyber crisis management. In the US, there's an IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act from 2020, essentially stating that NIST and the same one from the NIST Cybersecurity Framework will have authority to oversee IoT cybersecurity risks for the federal government, essentially talking security throughout the entire life cycle, from design through to sourcing, implementation, and obviously decommissioning of devices. Then also trying to include coordinated disclosure policies. So things like, you can consider it almost like a bug bounty program, but more of a coordinated way to disclose potential vulnerabilities in any devices or software. That's very important for, one, the public to be able to actually raise any concerns, and for it to be dealt with in a responsible manner. Also in 2022, California created an IoT cybersecurity law, a very vague statement saying devices must have reasonable security features, whatever that means. It's that usual legal term we also have in South Africa for POPIA, where you have to have reasonable security. So it's up really to, up to the vendors and so on to actually prove that there is reasonable security. But it is placing a lot of the liability and burden of proof on the IoT vendors themselves, as opposed to the actual end users. Then the other side, the privacy also comes into it. GDPR, POPIA, California's got the Consumer Privacy Act, but they're also now bringing in the California Privacy Rights Act. So you've got all these devices, and if you start talking things like fingerprint scanners, iris scanners, medical devices, there might be sensitive personal information on that. In South Africa, under POPIA, medical information is especially protected. If you have things like nanny cams, children are especially protected. So you are putting vulnerable populations in a very vulnerable position because of the internet and the cameras around them. So there does need to be a consideration around the privacy when you're implementing some of these devices. And actually, another law that we can consider in South Africa is RICA. Most people know about that for having to register your SIM cards, but RICA actually allows for interception of communications. So there is a burden of sort of responsibility to a certain degree on service providers, and in many organizations that provide emails, and maybe some of these operating these devices, they might need to actually keep a lot of data for records keeping purposes 3 to 5 years. And they might be able to need to provide law enforcement with a mechanism to intercept some of those communications. So things like that, most people do not actually consider relevant when talking about connecting various devices. And if you think about it, a lot of the Raspberry Pis and so on can have a slot for a SIM card. So if you have 1,000 IoT devices with SIM card slots, you need to RECA 1,000 SIM cards for those things. So laws that you don't necessarily think of may have bearing on IoT devices due to the connectivity. So there are some monitoring tools that are available on the internet. I think we have a little bit of time, so let me just jump onto my browser quickly. I'll stop sharing here and reshare if I can find the right browser. There it is. So Shodan is one of the most commonly known. So I was just doing a search the other day for MQTT protocol, and it'll start picking up various connections and so on. There's a nice little map. I'm just using a free version at the moment. I do have access to a community edition with a login, but if you pay, I think it's $50 once off, you get a whole bunch of cool reports and better maps and things. So you can look at sort of what's available across various countries and so on. I did find South Africa somewhere. Let's see. Here's Netherlands. They're pretty high up in terms of what's available on the internet. And here's South Africa, 1,600 devices. So about half of what's in the Netherlands. Looking at KR, I think South Korea, they have 360,000 devices. So that's quite a lot. China also seems to have quite a lot. But you can filter by country and a few other things. Census, again, is a similar type of search engine. You can find various hosts and so on, so I'll just do the same search. And they can find a number of things. Okay, cool. This one's in Slovenia. So it's picked up something. It's got a couple ports for MQTT protocol. There's some interesting mail protocols there, database, HTTP, all sorts of things picked up on that IP address. Something in China, France, more China, California, more China, there we go, Netherlands, Germany. So you can find a number of devices on the internet. Again, on the left-hand side, what ports you're looking at. 8443 seems to be a common one for MQTT. 1883 as well seems to be common. Some of the software vendors. So let's see if there's anything of interest here. Hikvision, there we go. That is very common in South Africa in terms of your CCTV cameras. So clearly there are a number of cameras open up on the internet there, which I know because one of the others will show you the cameras. Operating systems, let's see if there's anything. Windows, MySQL. Okay, nothing jumps out. Okay, there's GT and a few others. I was hoping to see like a Raspbian or one of those sitting there, but nothing interesting. Adverts, go away. Right, live cameras. This website can find a whole bunch of cameras. Here's 15 in South Africa. The one on the top left thinks we're in Australia because everything's upside down. But you can click on these things, and let's just take this one that looks like a traffic. And you can then see, looks like a roadside something or other. Could be one like this, something powering a speed camera, or could be a electronic road sign, one of those things that's solar powered by the looks of it, because there are solar panels over there. And you can also, for this, go through countries. The US has got the most, Japan, Taiwan, Switzerland. You can scroll by manufacturer. D-Link, again, is a common one. Okay, so there's a beach in Spain. Looks like someone's backyard in Italy. a door or could be a window with blinds in France. So all of these things are open on the internet. Just shows the concerns and what else we can get access to. Another one I posted up was gray noise. I haven't really played much with this one, but it's really good with sort of looking at traffic and so on across the network. Again, there's free versions and paid for versions. And then the Anissa's little tool. So you got baseline IoT security. You can download spreadsheets, talks about your encryption, your authentication, privacy by design, your third-party relationships, which will go under your governance and so on. There's for smart cars. So talks around all the various components of the car that could potentially be vulnerable and how you deal with them. Smart airports, smart cities, Industry 4. So let's go to the smart city. So there again, some security measures and good practices. You can filter on the right there by the threat group, security measures, and so on. And of course, in addition to this, there is a MITRE attack framework and the defend frameworks, which Justin Westcott will be talking about in the next presentation. So I'm not going to go into too much detail around that. I'll go back to my slides. So after that, in closing, some hacked road signs. I wish we could actually follow those instructions and cancel work and go back home when we feel like it. Just imagine trying to explain that to your boss if you don't put you up at work. The road sign told me to stay at home. So to close off, deployments of IoT devices are actually growing rapidly. I was trying to find some cool stats, but I couldn't really find anything consistent, somewhere in the billions, somewhere in the trillions, and it was all over the place. That means that the introduction of vulnerabilities that come with IoT devices are increasing. Hence the attack surface of organizations and even people at home with smart devices are potentially at risk. And a lot of these smart solar systems, again, have hard-coded passwords to access their built-in Wi-Fi, and they're on the internet. You can connect to these things to monitor what's happening with your power. You can make changes to how you want to, route the power to pump it back onto the grid or your house. And someone who's with malicious intent can potentially cause damage. We've seen a rapid increase of IoT-based attacks. So it's really important to have good governance and a responsible and secure design of the IoT devices themselves, but also the deployments within organizations. So we covered, or I just showed you briefly some of the best practice documents and some of the legislation, which will give you a starting off point in terms of what to think about. With most of these documents, there is no one size fits all. You need to adapt it to what's actually relevant to your organization. But that is pretty much me done. And I shall open for questions and discussion and stop sharing at this point. Thank you very much.
Likewise, thank you very much, Brett. There was a fascinating lecture, and I see a number of people have been clapping hands and having the various other emoticons floating by during your talk. So there are certainly a couple of places of surprise for most people. So you can probably also see the Q&A. It doesn't always refresh as people add things. I'll just read the first one to you if I can jump in right away. This one's from Ishmael, and Ishmael says, Prof, I'm curious about the integration of software-defined wireless sensor networks into the IoT framework. It seems that the IoT architecture closely resembles that of SDN and the wireless sensor network version of that. Could implementing SDN in IoT enhance security, or does it introduce additional complexities?
It could be both. Remember now you're dealing with software or at least code. So you could actually end up introducing vulnerabilities if you don't do it properly. If you can use your software-defined networks correctly and securely, then it will benefit security. So I think, like anything, you need to be able to deploy it with a good measure of governance, risk analysis, and you know, do a proper job of it and ensure your code is dealt with in terms of the software-defined networks. Again, even talking beyond IoT, things like just another example thing, we're talking about wireless sensor networks. Automated ports have had a problem, not purely through cyber means per se, but due to jamming of GPS, because a lot of the automated equipment needed the GPS, and if you jam that, they don't know what to do. So now if you can maybe spoof the GPS, you might have some equipment driving off the pier and into the water. And some organizations that specialize in maybe design of things with electromagnetic signals, wireless signals, and so on. When you start talking about wireless sensor networks, may have a problem, or just any form of Wi-Fi might have a problem because you're interfering with your own network if you're pumping out some strange signals. So again, things like a risk analysis is very, very important, and you need to consider, is it right for your organization? Is it actually going to enhance security, or is it going to cause more problems? A large organization might make sense. Small organization might not make sense.
And Brett, I wonder if I could just augment Ishmael's question there, and also at the same time encourage other people to drop their questions in the Q&A. And if you're completely unable to, please put up your hand as well. But Brett, not to encourage any form of conspiratorial thinking, but now that you have mentioned ships automation, GPS spoofing, and so on, things like what happened in Baltimore, for whatever reason that happened. Surely this is also a looming threat that every port authority is now thinking of.
Yeah. Interesting that there is a WhatsApp group I belong to with a number of senior security people around the country, and that was very quickly raised. Was it a cyber incident? As you correctly, it's pointless speculating that they will need to investigate. But yes, it's now within the realms of possibilities that I've got a feeling there has been an incident with a propulsion system being, it wasn't hacked, but they needed to pull data off the system when the ship was in port, and they plugged in a flash drive with a virus, and consequently the ship's propulsion had a virus. So it is within the realms of possibility. And I think, yes, I mean, in Durban, we've had a case where a ship broke its moorings because of a storm, but ports also have automatic mooring systems. So if you can hack into those, you release the ship. I know in Finland, Estonia, and so on, that they use similar systems. We have it in PE because of the wind. So again, if you happen to hack one of those things and the ship is now released into the harbor, you've seen what happens when it breaches the port or crashes into a bridge.
Indeed, indeed. And actually, another question's popped up. I'm very thankful for this one as well. It's from someone who I won't name right now, but you may recognize the question or the interest direction. But what's your opinion, Prof, on digital twin technology from a security exposure viewpoint, in particular for large organizations?
I haven't really looked at the digital twin in much detail, but unfortunately, my brain's also kicking back into quantum entanglement and quantum teleportation. But yeah, there's a lot of new technologies, and again, risk management governance is very, very important here. The danger of if we take a digital twin as an exact copy, that is a potential problem because vulnerabilities will then be copied across. If it's a digital twin as in so like your twin cities that are interconnected, again, it is potentially causing or creating a bridge for one city having a cyber incident to rapidly spread. it might just help propagate into a different country a little bit quicker than what will inevitably happen. If you look at how WannaCry, sorry, not WannaCry, NotPetya, moved from Ukraine across the world in a day or so. And some of the other olden day worms back in the early 2000s, I mean, global coverage in a matter of an hour or so. It might just speed things up a little bit, but inevitably, if you've got a worm, it's going to do it anyway. But you also actually, thing that my brain went through with the quantum side of things. That's becoming a very interesting field, and the new types of devices coming out. And I don't think you were at the conference at the time, Bruce. The concept of actual your AI and machine learning with quantum technology. That could be an interesting concept when we add robotics and things to all of that. So pretty much everything boils down to your risk management. And that's why I had it there. Governance actually enables all your other security. If you don't have it, or your governance is breaking down, you'll have a few security people sitting in their own corners trying to do their best in an ad hoc manner, which is not always effective.
Very well said. And actually, now that you mentioned the quantum word, it leads into another question related to that. So, given all of these lightweight devices, what are the prospects of being able to do post-quantum cryptography or quantum secure cryptography on those devices? And that's an interesting question also because 2 weeks ago we had a lecture by Thomas Atema from The Hague. And but one of the things that even at the leading edge like he is, that's not really discussed is how well post-quantum cryptography moves onto small devices.
Yeah, I think, well, we saw the Americans create a list of supposedly quantum secure or resistant encryption, only to have a legacy machine break the one very quickly. I think it's going to be a challenge. We've got lightweight protocols. The processing power on the IoT devices are obviously limited in comparison to what we have on a laptop or a cell phone these days. So you do need to allow for that in terms of both encryption and authentication. The question is also the data itself. If it's a basic sensor taking temperature measurements, do you really need quantum resistant cryptography versus maybe a privacy camera or fingerprint sensor? Yeah, maybe you would want something along those lines for physical access control. The other side, in terms of the quantum side, I think, we're not quite there yet with quantum computing, and a lot of it does still require very low temperatures. So when we start talking mixing quantum with IoT, that's even further out. But yeah, I think the encryption one is going to be easy. But it's again, who you're trying to hide the data from, a nation state, or does it need to be secure for 5 days just to prevent your kid sister seeing what you're watching on YouTube?
Well said. So, Brett, if I may allow one last question, we're a tiny bit over time, and people will in a moment have to go over to Justin's talk. But the following question is from Juanita, and Juanita says, "Prof, what's your opinion on the iPhone lawsuit in the United States and future implications for consumers and smart tech?"
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So one of the, and I've had to deal with challenges like that as well, particularly around the cloud services. The challenge becomes where the boundaries to privacy are, where the boundaries to liability becomes, and also state access to various sets of information. So obviously, in the government sector, you don't necessarily want other countries being able to just walk into the cloud and steal all your data. So generally, we try to avoid using anything in the US itself. Um, And we thought, okay, that's fine, we'll use Western Europe, until they managed to gain access to cloud services in Western Europe. So that was a little bit worrying. And I think that is also then extends now to your mobile devices, where and there's been a number of concerns with Apple and trying to gain access to iPhones for counter-terrorist operations, etc. The debate of national security versus privacy comes into it. Um, and I think it has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. If there is reasonable suspicion that you can get very useful information, maybe it's allowable, but at the same stage, you don't want to unleash certain countries with the ability to then demand access to pretty much anybody's device across the world, because and it's not only for iPhone devices as well. It can be, I mean, it's been raised. If you look at the 5G, with Huawei being banned in certain countries because of security concerns, there is that concern of access to information. So it's an interesting one of how it will pan out. My opinion essentially is, you can sometimes do the wrong things for the right reasons, or the right things for the wrong reasons. So hopefully common sense will prevail. The disadvantage is it will probably set a precedence, and whichever way it goes is going to cause complications, I think, across the world, for the precedence that it will set. But yeah, the challenge ultimately from a security perspective is, also from the privacy angle, is just because you can doesn't mean you should. And it doesn't sit well when people try and just gain access to private devices, and force their way in without following due process. So as long as we've got RICA in South Africa, allows similar types of access, but you have a process to follow. So as long as the law and ethics have been followed, then yeah, I suppose it's fine.
Very well said. So there's one remaining question that I think we'll just deal with offline, Brett,
Okay,
just
sure.
because of the time. And I apologize also to Cameron. It's a well-posed question, so we'll discuss that offline.
Okay.
But right now, I'd like to just thank you very much. A warm round of applause. I think I say that from everyone else in the audience as well. That was an excellent lecture. People will surely be going back to the recording to review that. And so at this point, I'd like to encourage everyone to hop over to the other link and join us for Justin's talk, which seamlessly connects to this. And in all likelihood, you'll also see Brett over there in the audience. You'll certainly see me in the audience as well. So thanks again, Brett. Really well done. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, so that can be the formal end of things as people start hopping over there. Brett, I'll just, if you don't see the Q&A, I'll just quickly tell you what Cameron's question is.
I've just got into it now.
Oh, cool.
Right. Okay, I'll respond to it now. Thanks.
Yeah. Very nice. Good. We'll let everyone get going,
Okay.
and
Right.
I'll see you over in the other talk if you're joining us there as well.
I hope to. Okay, see you in a
Fantastic.
little while.
Thanks.
Okay. Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.
See all of you. Cheers. Bye.